Good evening, dear listener. Midnight Cat is here, padding softly across the quiet stones of another age, while the lamps of the modern world grow dim around you. Settle beneath your blankets, let your breathing become slow and easy, and listen to the rain, whether it falls beyond your window or only in the country of imagination. Tonight, we are going inside a medieval castle, not as a conquering knight or a visiting king, but as a quiet observer, passing through gates that have long since vanished, following the gentle rhythms of people whose days began with bells, firelight, and the sound of footsteps in a cold stone passage. And perhaps, before we enter, we should ask a simple question. When we picture a medieval castle, why do we so often imagine only battles, banners, and armored men upon the walls? What happened in such a place on an ordinary morning, when no enemy stood outside, when the drawbridge remained lowered, when bread was rising in the bakehouse and damp cloaks steamed beside the kitchen fire? A castle was built for defense, certainly, but it was also a household, a workplace, a storehouse, a courthouse, and a small, crowded world of its own. So let us travel to a spring morning near the end of the 13th century, to a stone castle standing above a river crossing in western England. It is not one of the greatest royal fortresses, nor is it a ruin softened by ivy. It is alive, occupied, repaired, complained about, swept, smoked, guarded, and endlessly supplied. Its towers rise from a rocky slope, and beneath them a village gathers around a muddy road, a church, a mill, and a scatter of timber houses with pale smoke escaping through their roofs. The hour before dawn is the coldest. Mist lies thick along the river, hiding the far bank and turning the castle above it into a dark shape suspended between earth and sky. In the outer ward, puddles shine faintly beneath the walls. Rain has fallen during the night, and water still drips from the wooden hoarding above the gatehouse. Somewhere in the stables, a horse stamps, impatient with the chill. Somewhere else, a man coughs in his sleep. The first person moving through the ward is not a lord or a soldier, but a kitchen boy named Martin. He is 13 years old, thin from growing quickly, and wrapped in a woolen tunic that once belonged to someone broader. Its sleeves have been cut shorter, though not evenly, and the hem is stained with old grease. Martin crosses the yard carrying a covered clay lantern. The little flame inside throws the bars of light through the pierced sides, swinging over the wet ground with each of his steps. His task is to wake the kitchen fire. The great kitchen stands apart from the Lord's Hall, partly because of smoke and partly because fire is a danger no castle household can ignore. Its roof rises steeply, with vents near the top to release heat, though the smoke never leaves as neatly as anyone might wish. Martin pushes open the heavy door and enters a darkness smelling of ash, onions, dried herbs, and yesterday's roasted meat. The hearth is not truly dead. Beneath its pale crust, embers still wait. He kneels, sets down the lantern, and uses an iron poker to uncover their faint orange glow. Then he adds dry straw, splinters, and small pieces of wood. He bends close and blows until his eyes water. For a while, nothing happens. The embers brighten, fade, and brighten again. Then a tiny flame catches and runs along the straw with a soft, hungry sound. Soon the kitchen begins to return to life. A woman named Agnes arrives, carrying 2 buckets of water from the well. She is the undercook, broad-shouldered and practical, with a linen cloth tied around her hair. Behind her comes old Will, who has worked in the castle kitchen for longer than anyone remembers clearly. He complains of his knees, of damp firewood, and of merchants who charge too much for salt. Yet his hands remain steady, and he can judge the heat of an oven by holding his palm near its mouth. They speak little at first. Morning work does not require conversation. Porridge must be made for servants and guards. Bread must be sliced. Ale must be brought up from the cellar. A pot of peas, soaked overnight, is hung above the fire with leeks and a little salted bacon. In another vessel, water begins to warm for washing bowls and knives. Outside, the bell in the castle chapel rings for the first office of the day. Its sound is not loud, but within stone walls it travels strangely. It slips through narrow windows, along stairways, under doors, and into chambers where people stir beneath wool blankets. The chaplain rises. The gate guards stretch stiff backs. In the barracks near the outer wall, men reach for belts and boots while the darkness still presses against the shutters. High above the ward, in the keep, the lord's household wakes more slowly. The castle belongs to Sir Edmund de Vale, a minor nobleman with lands scattered across 3 counties and obligations to a more powerful earl. He is away at present, attending a court session many days' ride to the east. In his absence, the castle is governed by his wife, Lady Eleanor, and by the steward, Master Hugh, who keeps accounts with careful ink strokes and trusts no figure until he has checked it twice. Lady Eleanor's chamber is not the bare stone room that later centuries might imagine. Woven hangings cover much of the wall, reducing drafts and adding color. Red leaves, blue flowers, a hunting scene faded by smoke and years. Rush mats lie across the floor. A wooden chest stands near the bed, iron-bound and locked, holding clothes, household papers, and a small packet of letters. On a table beside the narrow window rests a bronze mirror polished until it gives back a dim, uncertain reflection. Her maid, Joan, has already opened the shutters. Gray morning enters the room. Through the window, the inner ward appears below, enclosed by walls and roofs. Servants cross it carrying wood, water, and baskets. A pair of geese wander where they should not, pecking at wet rushes near the hall steps. Lady Eleanor sits up and draws a fur-lined mantle around her shoulders. The castle is secure, but never comfortable in the way comfort will be understood in later ages. Stone keeps out blades and arrows more easily than it keeps out cold. Damp gathers in corners. Wind finds cracks around shutters. Even in spring, a person may wake with chilled hands. Joan brings a basin and a jug of water. The washing is brief. Water is precious, not because the castle lacks it, but because every drop used in an upper chamber must be carried there. Servants climb stair after stair with buckets and jugs, careful not to spill on the worn steps. Lady Eleanor rinses her fingers and face, then dresses in layers. Linen first, wool above it, a belt at the waist, and a veil arranged over braided hair. Below, the gatehouse begins its morning ritual. The portcullis is raised by men working a windlass. Chains tighten. Iron and timber groan. The sound echoes under the arched passage, deep enough to be felt through the soles of the feet. Then the outer doors open, revealing the road descending toward the village. A small group waits outside. There is a miller with a complaint about water rights, 2 women carrying baskets of eggs, a messenger from a neighboring manor, and a mason hoping to speak with the steward about repairs to the south tower. Each person is watched as they enter. The castle is a household, but it is also a guarded place. Names are asked. Bundles may be inspected. News is exchanged before coin ever changes hands. The messenger is admitted first. Mud reaches halfway up his boots, and his horse's flanks are dark with rain. He carries no grand sealed order, only a folded letter protected inside waxed cloth. Yet the arrival of any letter matters. Roads are slow, rivers uncertain, and news may travel for days before reaching a castle gate. The guard takes him toward the steward's chamber. Above them, from a slit window in the gatehouse tower, another man watches the mist begin to lift from the river. As the pale landscape appears, field by field, the castle reveals itself to the morning. Smoke rises from chimneys and roof vents. The kitchen fire burns brighter. The chapel bell falls silent. In the bakehouse, dough waits beneath linen cloths. In the stables, grooms begin brushing the horses. Near the hall, servants spread fresh rushes mixed with herbs over the floor, covering yesterday's dirt with the clean scent of mint and meadowsweet. And through all these small labors, the ancient stones remain still, holding the night's cold within them, as if the castle itself has not yet fully awakened. The scent of fresh herbs lingered only briefly before it mixed with the countless familiar smells of the castle. Smoke drifted from the kitchens, damp wool warmed near the fires, horses breathed softly in the stables, and the earthy fragrance of wet stone rose wherever the morning sun reached the walls. No single smell defined the place. Together, they formed an atmosphere that every servant, guard, child, and visitor recognized without thinking. Master Hugh, the steward, unfolded the messenger's letter with patient hands. His chamber overlooked the inner ward, though the window admitted more chill than light. Shelves lined one wall, crowded with wax tablets, parchment rolls, ink pots, bundles of sealed accounts, and small leather bags containing rents collected from nearby villages. A heavy table stood in the center, its surface worn smooth by years of careful bookkeeping. The letter came from Sir Edmund. It contained no startling news. The lord expected to remain away for another fortnight. There were legal matters still to settle, obligations to meet, and neighboring landowners with whom discussions continued at an unhurried medieval pace. He asked after the spring planting, reminded Hugh to inspect repairs on the western curtain wall, and sent affectionate words to Lady Eleanor. The steward smiled almost invisibly. Routine was welcome. Unexpected letters often carried requests for money, reports of illness, or warnings of unrest somewhere beyond the horizon. This one promised only more ordinary days, and ordinary days were the foundation upon which every successful household rested. Soon Lady Eleanor joined him. Together they reviewed the week's concerns. Several roof tiles needed replacing above the chapel. One dairy cow had become lame. The brewer believed another barrel of barley would be required before midsummer. Two tenants disputed the exact boundary between their grazing fields and wished for the lady's judgment later in the afternoon. Such conversations rarely appeared in the grand histories written by monks or chroniclers. Kings and battles filled their pages. Yet castles endured because someone remembered to purchase salt before supplies ran low, because roofs were repaired before heavy rain arrived, because grain was measured honestly, and because disputes over a single hedge were settled before they grew into feuds. Outside, the castle yard became steadily busier. Blacksmith Thomas had already lit his forge. His workshop stood against the inside of the curtain wall where sparks could be watched carefully. Soon the rhythmic ringing of hammer against iron spread through the air. Shoes for horses required replacing. A bent hinge from the north gate needed straightening. One guard presented a dented helmet that had suffered less from warfare than from being accidentally dropped down a stairway. Thomas examined it without surprise. Armor demanded constant care. Metal rusted, leather straps cracked, buckles loosened. Even during peaceful years, the smith rarely lacked work. Near the well, children carried out their own quiet duties. Not every child inside the castle belonged to noble families. Many were sons and daughters of servants, craftsmen, or laborers who lived within or just beyond the walls. They fetched water, gathered kindling, frightened geese away from vegetable patches, and delivered messages between workshops. Their games fit naturally around their work. One moment they raced sticks across puddles as though launching tiny ships. The next, they hurried obediently when an older servant called for help carrying baskets. Martin, the kitchen boy, had little time for either play or rest. Breakfast for the household was nearly ready. Large wooden bowls of oat porridge stood beside loaves of coarse bread baked the previous day. Fresh bread would emerge later, but the ovens served many purposes and followed careful schedules. Butter, cheese, onions, and small mugs of weak ale completed the simple meal for most workers. Water was not always the safest drink. Ale, lightly brewed and containing little alcohol, often accompanied meals throughout the day. Children drank it as well, though in much milder form than stronger brews reserved for feasts or honored guests. Within the great hall, long tables slowly filled. The hall formed the heart of castle life. Its timber roof stretched high overhead, supported by great beams darkened by decades of smoke. Colorful banners hung from the walls beside shields bearing the family's coat of arms. Narrow windows admitted shafts of pale sunlight that caught drifting particles of ash and dust, making them seem almost like tiny floating stars. At the far end stood the raised dais where the Lord's family dined. Even in Sir Edmund's absence, Lady Eleanor took her place there, though the atmosphere remained far less formal than during great celebrations. Nearby sat the chaplain, the steward, and several trusted officers of the household. Below them, servants, guards, craftsmen, and guests occupied the lower tables according to long-established custom. Meals reflected the order of medieval society as clearly as any written law. Yet everyone, from the highest seat to the lowest bench, paused briefly when the chaplain offered thanks before eating. Conversation then spread gradually across the room. News traveled not only through letters but through meals. The messenger described muddy roads where wagons frequently became trapped. A visiting merchant spoke of unusually fine wool available farther north. One guard claimed to have seen wolves near the forest several nights before, though another doubted the story, suggesting the shapes had been wandering dogs enlarged by darkness and imagination. Lady Eleanor listened more than she spoke. She understood that information gathered casually often proved as valuable as official reports. When breakfast ended, the hall transformed almost immediately. Tables were cleared. Benches shifted. Servants swept crumbs into baskets for poultry. The same room that had just hosted breakfast would later receive petitioners, conduct estate business, and perhaps welcome travelers before nightfall. Nothing within the castle remained devoted to a single purpose for very long. Even the chapel served more than worship alone. Its small stone interior offered a place for prayer, certainly, but also for quiet reflection, private meetings, and moments of stillness that balanced the constant movement elsewhere in the household. The morning sunlight now reached higher across the battlements. 2 guards paced slowly along the wall walk. Their duty demanded patience more than excitement. From above they watched fields brightening beyond the river. Farmers already guided oxen through damp earth. Smoke rose from village cottages. Ducks drifted lazily upon the water below. The countryside appeared peaceful. Still, habit required watchfulness. A castle existed partly because peace could never be assumed forever. One guard paused beside an archer's slit. From this narrow opening he could see far across the valley while remaining well protected himself. The design seemed simple, yet generations of builders had refined every angle. The slit widened toward the interior, allowing defenders room to move and aim while presenting only the smallest target to anyone outside. Below him, stonemasons chipped carefully at weathered blocks along the southern tower. Castles were never truly finished. Rain wore away mortar. Frost widened tiny cracks. Timber beams aged. Lead roofing shifted. Every season brought fresh repairs, and skilled craftsmen remained almost permanent members of the household. One elderly mason rested his hammer for a moment. He laid his weathered hand upon the cool stone beside him. Some of these blocks, he reflected silently, had already stood longer than any living person could remember. Lords had changed. Children had grown old. Harvests had come and gone beyond counting. Yet the wall remained, not because it was unchanging, but because countless hands had cared for it year after year. It was a quiet thought, one easily lost beneath the ringing of tools and the chatter from the yard below. Yet perhaps it captured the true nature of the castle better than any tale of sieges or tournaments. The fortress endured through ordinary mornings like this one, through buckets carried from the well, fires patiently tended before dawn, accounts carefully written, roofs repaired one tile at a time, and hundreds of unnoticed acts that allowed life behind the stone walls to continue with gentle, dependable rhythm as another peaceful day slowly unfolded. As the morning ripened toward midday, the castle settled into a quieter rhythm. The first urgency of dawn had passed. Fires were burning steadily. Breakfast had been cleared away, and every member of the household had found the work that belonged to the day. The sounds that filled the air no longer overlapped in a rush but rose and faded like gentle waves. A hammer rang from the smithy. A wheel creaked somewhere beyond the gate. From the chapel came the faint murmur of a prayer, almost carried away by the breeze before it reached the courtyard. Sunlight warmed only a few favored places. Most of the castle remained pleasantly cool. Thick stone walls, built to withstand attack and weather alike, surrendered little of the night's chill. In the shade of the inner ward, one could almost forget that spring had arrived. A servant carrying folded linen paused for a moment where the sunlight crossed the paving stones, turning her face toward its warmth before continuing on her way. In a chamber beside the great hall, Lady Eleanor prepared to hear the concerns of those who lived upon the estate. The room was modest compared with the hall itself, yet carefully arranged. A carved oak chair stood beside a long table covered with rolls of parchment, wax seals, and a pair of brass scales used for weighing small payments. The steward sat nearby with his ink and quills ready, his careful handwriting preserving decisions that might matter many years later. The first visitors were the 2 tenants who disagreed about the grazing boundary. Neither man raised his voice. Their concern was not born of anger so much as uncertainty. One believed that an old oak stump marked the proper line. The other insisted that the boundary had always followed a shallow stream. though the stream itself had shifted slightly over the years after heavy winter floods. Lady Eleanor listened without interruption. Only after each had spoken did she ask questions. How long had each family held the land? Had any older neighbors remembered the earlier boundary? What had been recorded in previous accounts? Such patience was expected of a noble household. Justice was not always perfect in the medieval world, but local peace often depended upon careful listening. A quarrel left unattended could trouble neighboring families for generations. The steward located an earlier record copied from an older document. Its faded writing described a boundary marked by both the stream and the great ash tree. The tree itself had long since fallen, but together with the memory of several elderly villagers, the description helped settle the matter. The two men bowed. Neither received everything he had hoped for, yet each accepted the judgment with quiet dignity. They departed, speaking more calmly than they had arrived. Outside, Martin was discovering another part of castle life that every young servant eventually learned. Nothing remained still for long. Barely had the morning meal been cleaned away before preparations for the evening began. Great joints of beef were inspected. Chickens clucked impatiently in wicker baskets. Herbs freshly gathered from the garden were washed in cool water. A barrel of salted herring was opened, releasing a sharp scent that filled one corner of the kitchen. Old Will supervised everything without appearing to hurry. He seemed to know precisely when each task should begin. "The fire teaches patience," he once remarked to Martin, though not on this particular day. "Rush it, and supper burns. Ignore it, and everyone waits hungry." Whether spoken today or many months earlier, the lesson remained true. Nearby, Agnes kneaded fresh dough upon a flour-dusted table. Her strong hands pressed, folded, and turned the soft mixture with a rhythm so steady that she scarcely needed to think about it. Bread was among the simplest foods prepared within the castle, yet also among the most important. Rich or poor, nearly everyone depended upon it. Beyond the kitchens lay the buttery. Despite its name, this room held much more than butter. Here, the household's ale, wine, cups, pitchers, and serving vessels were carefully stored. The butler, whose title came from the old word for bottles rather than butter itself, oversaw these supplies with remarkable attention. Every cask was counted. Every ladle had its place. Nothing belonging to the lord's household escaped careful record. Elsewhere, beneath the castle, another world stretched through cool passages cut partly into the rock. The cellars were dim even at midday. Only narrow openings admitted strips of pale light, leaving most corners dependent upon candles or oil lamps. Here rested barrels of ale, sacks of grain, smoked meat hanging from beams, wheels of hard cheese, onions braided together, apples preserved from the previous autumn, and carefully measured stores of salt. The air felt wonderfully cool after the warmth of the kitchen. It also carried a faint scent of earth. These storerooms represented security. A well-managed castle thought constantly about seasons yet to come. Harvests could fail. Roads might become impassable. Winters sometimes lingered longer than expected. Supplies gathered patiently through prosperous months offered protection against uncertain ones. Master Hugh descended the worn stone steps to inspect the stores himself. He carried a small wax tablet upon which he noted quantities needing replacement. His work lacked the excitement celebrated in songs, but without such quiet diligence, the strongest fortress could quickly become a hungry one. Far above, on the highest tower, another sort of work continued. The watch changed at midday. Fresh guards climbed the spiral staircase, passing those whose morning duty had ended. Each man paused briefly upon reaching the roof. The view never lost its power. The river wound through green fields like a polished ribbon. Sheep moved slowly across distant hillsides, appearing from that height no larger than drifting clouds. Tiny figures worked among newly planted crops. Far beyond, the forest formed a dark green border where the known landscape faded into mystery. One young guard had arrived only a month before. He found himself looking farther than necessary, wondering what towns lay beyond the horizon, what roads connected distant castles, what strangers traveled unseen beneath the forest canopy. Medieval people often journeyed less frequently than those of later centuries, yet curiosity traveled farther than feet ever could. A kestrel circled above the tower. Its wings scarcely moved. For several peaceful moments, bird and castle shared the same quiet sky. Within the walls, the chapel bell sounded once more. Its measured notes drifted across every courtyard and passage, gently reminding the household of the hour. Some paused for a brief prayer. Others simply listened before returning to their work. The bell marked not only religious devotion, but the passage of daily life itself, dividing labor into familiar portions that repeated with comforting regularity through the seasons. The castle had now fully awakened. Its many rooms, workshops, passages, towers, kitchens, storerooms, stables, and halls worked together like the parts of a living body. Every person, from the lady overseeing the estate to the smallest child carrying kindling across the yard, contributed in ways both great and small. And though travelers approaching from afar might first admire the towering walls, the battlements, and the proud gatehouse rising above the river, those who lived here understood a quieter truth. The real strength of a medieval castle was not found only in its stone. It lived in the patient hands that baked its bread, repaired its roofs, copied its accounts, tended its gardens, watched its gates, and kept its countless ordinary days flowing gently onward, season after season, beneath the steady passage of the sun across the ancient walls. By early afternoon, the sunlight had climbed high enough to brighten even the narrowest corners of the inner ward. Shadows withdrew beneath stairways and galleries, while the pale stone of the keep reflected a gentle warmth that would last only a few hours before the evening chill returned. The castle never entirely escaped the cold, yet there were moments like these when its walls seemed less severe, softened by birdsong and the quiet industry of those who called it home. The gardens lay tucked against the southern wall where they received the greatest share of the day's light. They were not large, nor arranged for ornament alone. Every patch of earth had a purpose. Neat rows of sage, parsley, fennel, mint, and rosemary grew beside onions and cabbages. Medicinal plants occupied another corner, carefully tended by an elderly woman named Margaret, whose knowledge had been gathered from her mother, from traveling monks, and from many years of observing which herbs eased fevers, soothed aching joints, or settled uneasy stomachs. She moved slowly among the beds with a woven basket over one arm. From time to time she paused, not merely to gather leaves, but to examine them. A yellowing stem, an insect nibbling at tender shoots, or soil that had become too dry all received her quiet attention. To Margaret, each plant possessed its own habits. Rosemary welcomed sunshine. Mint spread eagerly wherever it could. Lavender asked for patience before rewarding the gardener with its fragrance. Martin arrived carrying an empty basket from the kitchens. Old Will required fresh herbs for the evening meal, and Margaret selected each sprig with care. "Not too much time," she said softly. "It is strong enough to speak for itself." Martin nodded. He had learned that every task within the castle held small lessons hidden inside it. One did not simply fetch herbs. One learned which leaves bruised easily, which stems remained tender, and which scents lingered longest after cooking. Beyond the garden wall came the steady clatter of hooves. A merchant's cart had entered through the gatehouse. Its arrival stirred gentle interest throughout the household. Merchants did not appear every day, and even familiar faces carried with them hints of distant places. This particular trader had visited before, bringing cloth, iron tools, fine needles, beeswax candles, and small luxuries difficult to produce within the estate itself. The cart stood beneath an awning while its goods were uncovered. Bundles of dyed wool showed shades of blue, green, and russet that brightened the courtyard. Wooden boxes held combs carved from bone, polished buckles, and carefully wrapped packets of spices whose scents had traveled astonishing distances before reaching this quiet English castle. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and ginger had crossed seas and kingdoms. Few people handling those tiny packets could fully imagine the long journeys behind them. Ships had carried them across warm waters. Caravans had crossed mountains and deserts. Merchants speaking many different languages had bought and sold them countless times before they finally rested upon this humble table within the castle walls. Lady Eleanor examined the cloth with thoughtful fingers. Good fabric represented more than comfort. Clothing lasted many years when carefully mended, and purchasing new material required careful judgment. A length of fine wool might become a winter mantle. Strong linen could provide shirts or table coverings. Nothing was chosen carelessly. The steward quietly negotiated prices. Neither buyer nor seller hurried. Bargaining formed an expected part of trade. Each understood the familiar rhythm of offer and counter-offer, accompanied by smiles, thoughtful pauses, and occasional laughter. Nearby, several children watched the merchant unpack his wares with wide eyes. Brightly colored ribbons seemed almost magical compared with the muted browns and grays of everyday life. A polished piece of amber caught the sunlight like captured honey. Tiny bells chimed whenever the merchant lifted them from their wrapping. The children knew better than to touch. Looking alone offered its own quiet pleasure. Not far away, in the stable yard, the farrier inspected the castle's horses one by one. Each animal received patient attention. Hooves were cleaned of stones and packed mud. Harness straps were checked for wear. Thick winter coats had begun to shed with the arrival of spring, and brushes lifted loose hair into drifting clouds that floated briefly through the warm afternoon air. Among the horses stood an elderly mare that had carried Sir Edmund for many years. She no longer traveled great distances. Instead, she served quieter duties within the estate, drawing light carts and carrying messages to neighboring villages. The grooms treated her with gentle respect, speaking softly as they worked. Her faithful years had earned such kindness. Above the stables, swallows darted beneath the eaves. They had returned only recently after the winter. Their nests, built from countless tiny pellets of mud, clung securely beneath the beams exactly where generations of swallows had nested before. Their cheerful calls echoed across the courtyard, mingling with the sounds of people, animals, and distant hammering. Inside the castle workshop, another craft unfolded with equal patience. The carpenter shaped a new chest from seasoned oak. Wood shavings curled away beneath his sharp plane, gathering around his boots like pale ribbons. Every measurement mattered. A lid that failed to close tightly invited dampness. A poorly fitted joint weakened with time. His apprentice watched closely. Much of medieval learning happened in this quiet fashion. There were few written instructions. Instead, experienced hands demonstrated each movement, while younger eyes observed, repeated, failed, corrected themselves, and gradually mastered skills that might sustain them for the rest of their lives. As the afternoon lengthened, the castle settled into a comfortable calm. Some servants carried freshly washed linen into the sunshine where it fluttered gently between wooden posts. Others beat woven rugs free of dust or polished brass candlesticks until they reflected wavering patches of light. From the great hall came the scrape of benches being arranged once more. Soon it would welcome the evening meal. Rushes, newly scattered across the floor, released the faint scent of lavender and sweet flag whenever someone crossed them. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows at a lower angle now, painting long golden shapes across the timber floor before slowly climbing the opposite wall. No trumpet announced these quiet changes. No chronicler paused to record them. Yet this slow turning of the day, from morning labor toward evening gathering, formed the true heartbeat of castle life. It was repeated not only this week or this season, but year after year, shaped by weather, daylight, and the familiar needs of everyone who lived within these steadfast walls. And as the afternoon breeze carried the fragrance of herbs from the garden and fresh bread from the ovens, the old castle seemed to breathe with contentment, sheltering all who moved within it as gently as it had sheltered generations before them, while the sun continued its unhurried journey toward the western hills. The afternoon light gradually turned softer, losing the bright clarity of midday and taking on the warm golden color that seemed to suit old stone particularly well. The towers cast long shadows across the courtyards, and the sound of work changed almost without anyone noticing. Heavy labor slowed. Smaller tasks remained. The castle prepared itself, as it did every evening, for the peaceful arrival of night. In the bakehouse, the last loaves emerged from the great oven. Their crusts crackled quietly as they cooled upon broad wooden boards. The warmth filling the little building was almost startling after the cool passages outside. Flour still floated gently through the air, catching the sunlight that entered through a small window high in the wall. The baker, a cheerful man named Robert, tapped each loaf with practiced fingers. The sound told him nearly everything he wished to know. A well-baked loaf answered with a firm, hollow note. One that remained too soft returned to the fading heat for a few more minutes. There was no clock to consult, only long experience and careful attention. Martin helped carry basket after basket toward the kitchens. The fresh bread filled the corridors with its comforting aroma, and more than one servant smiled as it passed. Even after years of routine, the scent of newly baked bread remained one of life's simplest pleasures. In the kitchen itself, supper was well underway. The great cauldrons simmered steadily above glowing embers. Cooks basted roasting meat with its own juices, while herbs gathered earlier in the day disappeared into sauces and stews. The gentle fragrance of rosemary mingled with onions, leeks, and parsley, while pepper, used sparingly because of its great expense, added a faint warmth to the air. Old Will moved from hearth to table with remarkable calm. He never appeared hurried, although every dish depended upon careful timing. A young servant reached too quickly for an iron pot. "Use the cloth," Agnes reminded him with a patient smile before he touched the hot handle. The lesson required no further explanation. Elsewhere, in a chamber above the hall, Lady Eleanor spent a little time with her embroidery. The linen stretched across a wooden frame displayed the outline of flowering vines worked in colored silk. It was not unusual for noblewomen to supervise many practical matters while also taking part in skilled needlework. Such pieces decorated clothing, cushions, altar cloths, or wall hangings, and they represented many quiet hours rather than hurried effort. Joan sat beside the window spinning wool. The spindle turned gracefully between her fingers. Outside, pigeons settled upon the roofs, cooing softly as they searched for comfortable places to rest. Beyond the walls, smoke rose from the village as families prepared their own evening meals. Though separated by rank and circumstance, the castle and the village followed the same setting sun. Below, the chapel welcomed a handful of worshippers before supper. Candles flickered gently before the small altar. The stone walls, cool throughout the day, held the voices of those who prayed until each word seemed to linger for a moment after it had been spoken. The chaplain offered familiar prayers, neither long nor elaborate, and afterward many remained quietly seated for a few peaceful moments before returning to their duties. Near the gatehouse, the guards prepared for the night watch. The captain inspected crossbows, counted arrows, and spoke briefly with the men assigned to the towers. There had been no sign of danger all day, and he expected none before morning. Yet habit and discipline were companions that never slept. The drawbridge would remain lowered until dusk. Travelers still had time to arrive. As if summoned by the thought itself, a pair of pilgrims appeared along the road. Their cloaks were dusty from many miles of walking, and each carried the simple possessions needed for a long journey. They asked humbly for permission to remain within the outer ward until dawn, before continuing toward a shrine several days away. Hospitality held an honored place in medieval life. After brief conversation with the steward, space was found for them among other travelers. They would receive modest food, shelter from the weather, and fresh water before resuming their journey with the sunrise. One of the older servants quietly filled 2 wooden bowls with stew. No announcement accompanied the gesture. It was simply another part of the day's work. In the stables, the horses settled as fresh straw was spread beneath them. The grooms moved gently between the stalls, carrying lanterns whose warm light shone upon polished harness and neatly stacked saddles. One by one, the animals finished their feed and lowered their heads contentedly. The elderly mare closed her eyes while a groom brushed the last traces of dust from her coat. Outside, the swallows that had filled the afternoon sky now disappeared beneath the eaves, where their nests waited in the fading light. The castle itself seemed quieter with every passing moment. From the highest tower, the watchman observed the countryside changing color. The fields that had glowed bright green beneath the afternoon sun now softened into deeper shades of olive and gold. The river reflected the sky like polished metal. Far away, cattle wandered slowly toward their buyers, while shepherds gathered their flocks for the night. The watchman leaned lightly against the cool stone. His task required patience, but it also offered moments a few others enjoyed. From this height, he could witness the gentle closing of another ordinary day, watching the shadows lengthen across the valley exactly as they had done for generations before him. Soon the bell sounded once again. Its familiar voice drifted over the castle, across the village, and out toward the surrounding fields. Workers paused. Doors closed. Lanterns were lit. The day's labor had not entirely ended, for kitchens would remain busy, guards would keep their watch, and fires would need tending through the night. Yet a quieter mood settled over every courtyard and chamber. Within the ancient walls, supper would soon gather the household together once more, while beyond the castle the first evening stars began to appear above the darkening hills, silent companions to the enduring fortress that had watched countless sunsets pass in exactly the same unhurried way. The great hall looked different by candlelight. As daylight slipped away beyond the narrow windows, servants moved quietly from one iron bracket to another, touching their tapers to waiting candles. Flames awakened one by one, casting a gentle glow across the timber roof and sending soft shadows climbing over the stone walls. The banners that had seemed bright beneath the afternoon sun now appeared deeper in color, their reds and blues warmed by the flickering light. The evening meal was the largest shared gathering of the day. People entered gradually rather than all at once. Guards arrived after handing over their duties to the night watch. Craftsmen washed the dust from their hands before taking their places. Servants came and went constantly, rarely remaining seated for long, carrying trenchers, jugs, and steaming pots from the kitchens. Fresh bread was placed upon the tables first. Then came thick vegetable pottage, enriched with onions, leeks, beans, and herbs from the castle garden. There was roasted beef for the Lord's table, while many others enjoyed generous portions of stew flavored with bacon and barley. Hard cheese, butter, apples preserved through the winter, and small dishes of mustard completed the meal. No two tables were exactly alike. Rank determined what was served, yet nearly everyone ate food grown, stored, or prepared through the shared labor of the estate itself. Lady Eleanor offered a brief nod to the musicians waiting near the far wall. There were only two that evening. One carried a small harp, its polished wood glowing in the candlelight. The other held a simple pipe carved from elder wood. They did not perform loudly. Their melodies drifted gently through the hall, never overpowering conversation but weaving quietly between the voices. Music belonged naturally to castle life. Not every evening included entertainment, and grand performances were usually reserved for feast days or distinguished guests. Still, simple tunes accompanied many ordinary suppers, bringing a welcome sense of warmth after a day's work. Martin paused for only a heartbeat beside one of the pillars. His duties required him to refill pitchers and carry empty bowls back toward the kitchens. Yet, for a brief moment, he listened to the harp. The melody reminded him of nothing in particular, only of peaceful evenings much like this one. Before long, Agnes caught his eye with a patient smile, and he hurried back to his work. Old Will noticed without saying a word. Perhaps every kitchen servant, no matter how experienced, had once paused to listen to music while carrying a heavy tray. Conversation flowed easily throughout the hall. The merchant spoke of bridges damaged by recent floods farther north. The mason reported good progress repairing the southern tower. One groom proudly described the birth of a healthy foal on a neighboring estate, while another wondered whether the coming summer might be warmer than the last. No one knew. The weather belonged to God, as most people of the age believed, and could only be observed with hope and humility. The chaplain occasionally smiled at the stories passing around him. He had traveled farther than many within the household during his younger years, studying for a time at a cathedral school. Yet he found quiet satisfaction in listening rather than speaking, content to hear the ordinary concerns that shaped the lives of those around him. As the meal drew to a close, wooden cups were filled once more. Some drank ale, others watered wine according to custom and station. Trenchers that had served as plates were gathered carefully. Those made from stale bread would not be wasted. Many would be shared with poorer villagers, or fed to the household's animals. Very little was thrown away. Centuries before modern conveniences, usefulness was a habit woven into everyday life. In the kitchens, the work continued long after supper had ended. Iron pots needed scrubbing with sand and hot water. Knives were dried immediately to guard against rust. Ashes were drawn carefully from the hearth, though enough glowing embers remained buried beneath fresh ash to make lighting tomorrow's fire much easier. Martin watched old Will cover the embers. "It sleeps," the old cook said quietly. "Just like us?" Old Will chuckled. "Not quite. If we've done our work well, it wakes before we do." The two returned to cleaning in comfortable silence. Outside, darkness gathered steadily across the castle grounds. The drawbridge rose with slow, familiar certainty. Chains tightened. The heavy timbers lifted inch by inch until the bridge rested securely above the ditch. Then the great wooden gates were barred from within. The portcullis, lowered earlier, completed the evening ritual. The castle had closed itself against the night. Within the gatehouse, lanterns burned softly. The guards settled into the long patience of the night watch. They checked their cloaks against the cooling air and spoke in low voices that soon faded into silence. Most nights passed without incident, yet careful watchfulness was itself part of the castle's rhythm. Far below the walls, the village grew quiet. One by one, cottage windows darkened. Dogs barked briefly before settling near their masters' doors. Smoke drifted lazily upward from dying hearth fires. Somewhere across the river, an owl began its nightly call. From the highest tower, the stars emerged in astonishing numbers. Without the lights of later centuries, the heavens stretched brilliantly from one horizon to the other. Familiar constellations guided travelers, marked the seasons, and inspired stories repeated around countless fires through the generations. The watchman looked upward for a moment before returning his gaze to the countryside. The valley had become a landscape of silver and shadow. Moonlight rested gently upon the river, while the fields beyond seemed wrapped in quiet mist. Within her chamber, Lady Eleanor finished reading Sir Edmund's letter once more, before placing it carefully inside the iron-bound chest. Joan added another piece of wood to the fireplace. The flames answered with a soft crackle. Outside the narrow window, the castle stood peaceful beneath the moon, every tower and roof outlined in pale light. Somewhere below, footsteps echoed briefly along a stone passage before fading away. Lady Eleanor offered a final evening prayer, thanking God for the ordinary blessings of a calm day, a safe household, plentiful stores, faithful servants, and peaceful fields. Such days could never be taken for granted. Yet tonight, the old fortress rested easily. Its walls had sheltered another sunrise, another day's honest labor, and now another gentle evening. Beneath the watchful stars, with its fires banked low and its gates securely fastened, the medieval castle settled into the deep, unhurried stillness of the night, ready to greet whatever the next dawn might quietly bring. Night settled over the castle with remarkable gentleness. There was no single moment when the household became silent. Instead, each familiar sound faded in its own time. The laughter that had lingered after supper disappeared first. Doors closed one after another. Wooden shutters were fastened against the cool air. The last buckets of water were carried from the well, and the final footsteps in the great hall gave way to the softer rhythm of those who worked while others slept. The castle was never truly asleep. Beneath the moon, it simply changed its caretakers. The watch on the eastern wall exchanged quiet greetings as another pair of guards climbed the narrow spiral staircase. Each man knew the route so well that he scarcely needed the lantern fixed to the wall below. The stone steps curved tightly around the central pillar, worn smooth by countless feet over generations. Here and there, a shallow hollow had formed where boots had pressed against the same place year after year. When the younger guard reached the battlements, he drew a slow breath. The night air carried the scent of damp grass from the valley below. Somewhere beyond the walls, a fox barked sharply before vanishing into the darkness. The river reflected the moon in broken ribbons whenever its current disturbed the surface. His older companion leaned comfortably upon the parapet. "There," he whispered, pointing toward the southern fields. For a moment, the younger man imagined danger. Instead, he saw only dozens of tiny lights dancing above the grass. Fireflies. Their gentle glow drifted over the meadows, rising and falling with such calm that they seemed like little wandering stars that had forgotten their place in the heavens. The older guard smiled. "I've watched them every summer since I was a boy." Neither man spoke again for several minutes. There was no need. Far below, the stable remained quietly awake. One of the younger horses shifted uneasily in its stall, disturbed perhaps by an unfamiliar sound beyond the walls or by a dream known only to horses. Thomas, the stable groom assigned to the night's care, crossed the straw with an oil lamp held low. He laid a reassuring hand upon the animal's neck. The horse relaxed almost immediately. Thomas checked each stall in turn. Water buckets were full. Harness hung neatly upon their pegs. Saddles rested beneath linen covers to keep away dust. Satisfied, he paused beside the elderly mare who had served Sir Edmund for so many years. She lifted her head as he approached. "Easy now," he murmured. She recognized his voice. After accepting a gentle scratch behind one ear, she lowered her head again and returned peacefully to her rest. Across the courtyard, the kitchen retained a little warmth from the day's cooking. Most of the fires had been reduced to glowing embers hidden beneath pale ash. Their quiet heat lingered within the great hearth, promising that tomorrow morning's work would begin a little more easily. Martin had finished his duties at last. His sleeping place was simple, shared with several other boys in a chamber near the kitchens. Straw mattresses rested upon wooden frames, each covered with a wool blanket and a folded cloak that served as an extra pillow when winter winds found their way indoors. The room smelled faintly of smoke, clean straw, and fresh bread. Within moments of lying down, one boy was already snoring softly. Another whispered a few sleepy words about tomorrow's chores before drifting into silence. Martin remained awake a little longer. He thought about the merchant's colorful cloth, about the swallows beneath the eaves, about the fireflies the guards might be seeing above the fields, though he knew nothing of them tonight. Soon, even those thoughts became slower. Sleep arrived quietly. Elsewhere within the castle, Master Hugh still worked by candlelight. The steward preferred to complete his accounts while the household rested. His chamber was peaceful now. Only the scratching of a goose-feather quill disturbed the silence. One column recorded grain stores. Another listed payments received from nearby tenants. Beside them lay notes concerning repairs to the south tower and the purchase of fresh iron nails from the visiting merchant. The numbers themselves held little poetry. Yet to Hugh they told the story of the estate as clearly as any chronicle. A plentiful harvest. A roof repaired before winter. A careful purchase that saved precious silver. Every figure represented real people, real labor, and another small thread woven into the life of the castle. At last he sprinkled fine sand across the fresh ink to dry it. Closing the ledger, he extinguished the candle. Darkness reclaimed the room almost at once. Only the moon continued its silent journey beyond the narrow window. In the chapel, a single sanctuary lamp still burned. Its tiny flame reflected faintly from polished brass, casting a warm circle of light upon the surrounding stone. The building seemed larger at night than during the day. Shadows gathered gently beneath the arches, while the familiar scent of beeswax and old timber filled the quiet air. The chaplain entered alone. He offered one final prayer before resting. His footsteps echoed softly as he departed, leaving the little flame to keep its lonely watch until dawn. Beyond the walls, mist once again began rising from the river. It spread slowly across the meadows exactly as it had the night before, wrapping the fields in pale silver. The village disappeared beneath it, roof by roof, until only the church tower remained visible. From the highest turret, the castle seemed almost to float above a sea of cloud. Generations of watchmen had seen this same sight. Generations before them had watched winter frost glitter on the fields, autumn fog drift through the valley, and spring moonlight rest upon the water. The castle changed little from one year to the next, yet every night possessed its own quiet beauty. Within its ancient walls, hundreds of sleeping hearts beat peacefully, protected not only by stone and timber, but by the steady rhythm of shared work, familiar customs, and ordinary days that had gently carried the household from sunrise to moonrise once again. And while the stars wheeled slowly across the sky above the silent towers, the fortress waited patiently for the first pale hint of another medieval dawn. When the chapel bell would ring once more, the kitchen fire would awaken from its bed of glowing embers, and life inside the castle would begin again with the same calm purpose that had sustained it for generations. Long before the first hint of sunrise touched the eastern horizon, the castle remained wrapped in darkness. The moon had begun its slow descent, leaving the sky to the countless stars that shimmered above the valley. Their light was faint, yet in the clear spring air it was enough to trace the outline of towers, chimneys, and battlements against the heavens. The old fortress seemed less like a work of human hands, and more like another hill rising naturally from the rock beneath it. Only a few souls were awake. The night watch continued its careful rounds, cloaks drawn tightly against the cool air that drifted from the river. Every hour or so, one guard would pause beside another, exchange a few quiet words, and continue along the wall walk. Their lanterns cast small circles of amber light that briefly illuminated rough stone before disappearing around another corner. There was comfort in familiar repetition. The same staircases were climbed, the same gates were checked, the same locks were tested by steady hands. Most nights revealed nothing unusual, and that was exactly as everyone hoped. In the village below, the final hearth fires had long since faded. Only a baker's oven still glowed faintly through a shuttered window, where tomorrow's bread was already beginning its slow rise. Medieval life followed the daylight as closely as the seasons themselves, yet certain tasks quietly ignored the clock. Dough required patience. Cheese matured in its own time. Ale fermented without concern for sunrise or sunset. Within the castle cellars, the silence was profound. The thick walls muffled every sound from above. Rows of barrels rested motionless in the cool darkness. Sacks of grain stood neatly against the walls. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with faint traces of rosemary, sage, and mint. Somewhere, a single drop of water fell from the stone ceiling into a shallow puddle below. Its tiny echo lingered. The castle possessed countless little voices during the night. Timbers settled almost imperceptibly after the warmth of the day. A distant shutter creaked softly in the breeze. Rainwater, trapped in gutters after yesterday's shower, found its slow path through carved stone channels. None of these sounds alarmed the watchman. Each belonged to the building itself. The fortress was old enough to have its own habits. In Lady Eleanor's chamber, the fire had burned low. Only a few glowing logs remained beneath a covering of white ash. The room had grown noticeably cooler, and Joan, sleeping on a small pallet nearby, stirred briefly before pulling her blanket a little closer. Heavy curtains around the bed helped keep away drafts, but they could never banish them completely. Castles were magnificent from a distance. Within them, people learned to appreciate warm clothing, thick blankets, and well-built fireplaces. Far below, Thomas made one final round through the stables before allowing himself a short rest. The horses slept standing or lying according to their own comfort. Their slow breathing filled the stable with a peaceful rhythm. One young foal dreamed, its legs twitching gently while its mother stood nearby, calm and watchful. Thomas smiled quietly. Animals, like people, found reassurance in familiar places. He trimmed the wick of his lantern, checked that the stable doors were secure, and stepped outside. The eastern sky remained dark. Yet there was something different now. The stars nearest the horizon had begun to fade. It was a change so gradual that only someone accustomed to the hours before dawn would notice it. The longest part of the night had already passed. Near the kitchens, Martin shifted beneath his blanket. Without fully waking, he heard the distant call of an owl replaced by the first tentative song of a blackbird somewhere beyond the walls. Birds often greeted the morning before people did. One voice became two, then three. Soon the silence itself seemed to grow lighter, gently filled by the earliest chorus of the countryside. On the highest tower, the watchman noticed the same change. He turned toward the east. A pale ribbon of silver rested along the horizon, separating the dark land from the even darker sky. Above it, the stars slowly surrendered one by one, until only the brightest remained. Mist still covered the river. From this height, it looked like a broad white road winding through the valley. Trees emerged from it only at their upper branches, giving the strange impression that they floated upon clouds. The watchman had seen this sight hundreds of times. Still, he never hurried past it. Every dawn carried its own quiet beauty. As the first true light appeared, the stone walls of the castle changed color almost magically. Gray became pale gold. The towers, which had seemed severe beneath the moon, now welcomed the morning with gentle warmth. Moisture gathered during the night sparkled upon the grass inside the ward before disappearing beneath the growing sunlight. A servant crossed the courtyard, carrying empty buckets toward the well. She was the first member of the daytime household to begin her work. Soon another figure emerged from a doorway carrying firewood. Then another. Without command or announcement, the castle slowly awakened exactly as it had the morning before. Deep inside the kitchen, old Will entered before anyone else. He knelt before the great hearth where yesterday's embers had slept beneath their blanket of ash. With the tip of his iron poker, he carefully uncovered them. A faint glow answered. Not bright, not strong, but alive. He smiled to himself. The old fire had faithfully waited through the long night. Adding fresh straw and slender pieces of dry wood, he bent close and breathed gently. For a few quiet moments nothing happened. Then, just as always, a tiny flame appeared, dancing delicately across the straw before growing steadily stronger. The first warmth of a new day spread slowly through the kitchen. Outside, the chapel bell rang once again. Its clear notes drifted across the waking castle, over the misty river, and into the village beyond, where shutters opened and smoke began rising from cottage chimneys. Another ordinary day had begun. There would be bread to bake, roofs to mend, gardens to tend, horses to groom, letters to write, accounts to balance, children to teach, prayers to offer, and meals to prepare. None of these tasks would find their way into the grand chronicles of kings and kingdoms, yet together they formed the quiet heartbeat of medieval life. Within these enduring stone walls, another sunrise brought not the promise of glory, but something gentler and perhaps even more enduring. The comfort of familiar work, shared purpose, and the peaceful certainty that, just as yesterday had become today, so too would today one day become a treasured memory, carried silently within the ancient castle's weathered stones. Morning unfolded once again with the unhurried certainty that governed nearly every season of medieval life. The first rays of sunlight reached the upper battlements while the courtyards below still rested in cool shadow. Dew sparkled upon the herbs in the garden, each tiny droplet reflecting the growing light before quietly disappearing into the warmth of the day. Swallows emerged from beneath the eaves in swift circles, greeting the morning with cheerful calls that echoed between the stone walls. Martin had already carried 2 buckets of water before most of the household had broken their fast. The work no longer felt unfamiliar. His steps through the castle had become as natural as the winding passages themselves. He knew which flagstones became slippery after rain, which doors creaked despite every attempt to oil their hinges, and which stairway remained pleasantly warm because its wall shared the chimney from the great kitchen. Old Will greeted him with a nod. No words were necessary. The fire had grown lively once more, and iron pots already hung above the dancing flames. Oats simmered gently while fresh milk, brought in from the dairy only moments earlier, waited in cool earthenware jugs. A loaf, baked the previous evening, was sliced carefully upon a broad oak table, every piece measured with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to feeding many mouths without waste. Outside, the dairy itself had become busy. The castle's cows grazed beyond the walls during the day, but the morning milking took place before they were led into the surrounding meadows. Wooden pails filled with warm milk were carried into the dairy house, where the air remained pleasantly cool even as the sun climbed higher. The dairymaid, Alice, worked with remarkable patience. Some of the milk would be drunk fresh, some would become butter, some would be carefully transformed into cheese that might last for many months if stored properly in the cool cellars beneath the castle. Butter making required steady rhythm rather than strength alone. The churn moved back and forth with quiet persistence. At first, nothing seemed to change. Then, almost magically, tiny yellow grains began separating from the buttermilk until they gathered into a rich golden mass. Alice smiled softly. It happened every time, yet it always seemed a small miracle of ordinary life. Nearby, bees wandered among the flowering herbs. Several woven straw hives stood against the warm southern wall, carefully sheltered from strong winds. The beekeeper approached them slowly, not wishing to disturb their morning work. Honey was precious. It sweetened food, flavored medicines, and provided wax for candles that illuminated the chapel and the Lord's chambers. Every hive represented months of patient care and careful observation. The gentle hum of thousands of bees blended with bird song until the entire garden seemed quietly alive. In another corner of the castle grounds, two young pages practiced their reading beneath the guidance of the chaplain. Books were rare treasures. The volume resting upon the small lectern had been copied by hand years earlier, each letter carefully formed with ink upon smooth parchment. The boys traced the lines slowly, sounding out unfamiliar Latin words, while the chaplain corrected their pronunciation with calm encouragement. Learning demanded perseverance. Mistakes were expected. Each carefully read sentence became another small step toward understanding a world preserved within precious manuscripts. Not every child received such instruction. Most learned the skills required by their families through daily work rather than written words. A carpenter's son watched planes and chisels. A mason's daughter learned the careful mixing of mortar. A cook's apprentice discovered the language of herbs, fire, and timing. Knowledge passed from hand to hand as faithfully as it passed from page to page. Near the smithy, Thomas the blacksmith heated a length of iron until it glowed bright orange. The forge roared softly. Bellows breathed fresh air into the coals, raising the heat until tiny sparks danced upward like glowing insects before fading into the daylight. Thomas lifted the iron with long tongs and laid it upon the anvil. His hammer rose, then fell. Each measured blow shaped the metal little by little. There was no haste. Iron, like bread dough or growing trees, rewarded patience more than force. A farmer waited nearby with a broken plowshare. Spring planting depended upon such tools, and Thomas understood that every day's delay mattered to fields waiting beyond the castle walls. Before long, the damaged edge had been repaired, cooled in a barrel of water with a hiss of steam, and returned to its grateful owner. The castle served not only those who lived within it. People from the surrounding villages arrived throughout the week seeking judgment, trade, repairs, protection, or simple advice. Its walls enclosed a household, but its influence reached far into the countryside. By late morning, the market space outside the gate had begun to fill. Though not a great fair, it offered welcome opportunity for exchange. Farmers displayed eggs, vegetables, and bundles of wool. A potter arranged sturdy cooking vessels upon a blanket spread across the ground. A fisherman presented baskets lined with fresh reeds, holding trout caught at dawn in the nearby river. Castle servants visited with woven baskets over their arms. So did villagers. Conversation flowed easily between buyers and sellers. News traveled as readily as goods themselves. Someone spoke of lambs born unusually early this spring. Another described a bridge several miles away that would soon require repairs. A traveler passing through mentioned seeing cranes gathering beside distant marshes during his journey. Such small pieces of information drifted from person to person, weaving together the shared knowledge of the countryside. Above them all, the castle watched quietly. Its towers cast reassuring shadows across the busy scene below. Children laughed as they chased one another between market stalls before being gently called back by smiling parents. Dogs dozed in patches of sunshine. Horses flicked their tails lazily while waiting beside carts. Nothing about the morning would seem remarkable to those living it. Yet perhaps that was its greatest gift. For history is not made only of coronations, sieges, or famous names carved into stone. It is also made of butter patiently churned before breakfast, of bees gathering nectar among castle herbs, of blacksmiths mending plows, of children sounding out difficult words, and of neighbors exchanging quiet greetings beneath walls that had watched generations come and go. As the bell announced the approach of midday once more, life within and around the medieval castle continued with the same calm, dependable rhythm that had echoed through its courtyards for decades, reminding everyone who lived there that the truest strength of such a place was found not only in its stone, but in the countless ordinary lives that gave those ancient walls their enduring heart.